The Man at the Window. Mia was 13 when she experienced the worst fear of her life. She had just moved to a new town, and the neighborhood was still unfamiliar. Her family's house backed onto a small patch of woods, which seemed quiet during the day but took on an unsettling feel as the sun went down. One night, Mia's parents were working late, so she was home alone with her little brother, Jamie, who had already fallen asleep. She was on her bed scrolling through her phone, trying to ignore the occasional creaks and groans that echoed through the house as it settled. Then, as she glanced up, her heart stopped. A face was pressed against her bedroom window. It was a man, his skin pale and his eyes wide and unblinking, staring straight at her. She froze, her phone slipping from her hands. For what felt like hours, he simply stared, his breath fogging up the glass as if he was savoring every moment of her horror. She finally managed to reach for her phone and dial 911. Her voice trembled as she whispered to the operator. She was too scared to move, even as the police sirens wailed in the distance. As they pulled up, the man turned and slinked back into the woods, vanishing without a trace. The police never found him, and Mia's parents assured her it was a one-time thing, probably a lost tiger or some random prowler. But sometimes, when she lies awake at night, she swears she sees a shadow lurking just at the edge of the woods, waiting for another chance to watch her from the dark. The mysterious static. In college, Tom moved into an old, run-down apartment that was infamous on campus for its cheap rent, and for being a little off. It was isolated, cold, and had a strange smell that no amount of cleaning could seem to fix. But Tom was just glad to have his own place. Besides, he wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. But then he started noticing the TV. Every night, at exactly 3:33 a.m., it would turn on by itself. The screen would be filled with nothing but static, buzzing and crackling loud enough to wake him. At first, he brushed it off, thinking it was just faulty wiring or an old remote acting up. But no matter what he did, unplugging the TV, taking out the batteries in the remote, even switching outlets, the TV would still come on, showing nothing but endless static. One night, Tom finally decided he'd had enough. When the TV clicked on at 3:33, he grabbed his phone to record it, figuring he could show the landlord as proof of his frustrations. But as he watched the screen through his phone, he noticed something unusual. In the static, he could make out faint shapes, a dark figure standing just on the other side of the screen, facing him, watching him with eyes that seemed to glow through the static. The next day, he left the apartment, moving out in such a rush that he didn't even bother to get his security deposit back. He never told anyone the full story, and he never looked back at that building again. Don't turn around. Megan was a night owl, often staying up well past midnight to work on her writing. She always kept the lights dim and the curtains closed, preferring to work in near darkness. One night, though, she was so absorbed in her writing that she didn't notice the hours slipping by until it was nearly 3 a.m. That's when she heard it, a faint, shuffling sound, like someone dragging their feet on the carpet behind her. At first, she tried to ignore it, thinking it must just be the house settling. But then the noise came again, this time closer, and followed by the unmistakable sound of whispering. It was soft, almost too quiet to hear, but she was certain someone was saying, "Don't turn around. Don't turn around." Her heart was racing. She could feel the cold, prickling sensation that comes with being watched. Her mind screamed at her to look, but the whispering continued, urging her to keep her eyes forward. After what felt like hours, the sound faded away, leaving her alone in the silent room. She didn't dare turn around until the sun was rising, casting weak light across her desk. She slowly got up and searched the whole house, but found no signs of anyone. But from that day on, she occasionally hears the faintest whispers at night. Each time, they tell her the same thing, "Don't turn around." The Stranger in the Woods. When Jake was a teenager, he and his friends loved exploring the woods near their neighborhood. One summer night, they decided to camp out there. They set up their tent, told ghost stories by the fire, and eventually, exhausted, all drifted off to sleep. Around 3 a.m., Jake woke up to the sound of footsteps crunching through the leaves nearby. Half asleep, he figured it was one of his friends going to relieve himself. But as he lay there, listening, he realized something was off. The footsteps were too heavy, and they didn't come from any particular direction. They circled their tent, slow and deliberate. Jake held his breath as he heard a low voice muttering from outside. He couldn't make out what it was saying, but the sound made his skin crawl. Then, he heard the quiet zip of the tent's entrance being opened. In a flash, Jake grabbed his flashlight and clicked it on, pointing it toward the noise. Outside, just a few feet away, stood an old man with a scraggly beard and wide, empty eyes staring into the tent. His face was expressionless, his lips moving in a soft, rhythmic chant. Jake's friends woke up, gasping as they saw the man too, and within seconds they were scrambling out of the tent, racing back to town. The police investigated the area the next morning, but found nothing, no signs of a stranger, no traces of anyone around their campsite. But to this day, Jake sometimes hears that soft muttering in the back of his mind whenever he's alone in the woods. The Phantom Hand. Liz was home alone one night, her parents out of town, and her siblings away for the weekend. She was lying in bed reading, trying to ignore the occasional creaks of the old house. She had just put her book down and was about to drift off when she felt it, a light, gentle pressure on her shoulder, as if someone was reaching over her. Startled, she jerked upright and looked around, but there was no one there. She brushed it off as her imagination and lay back down, but she couldn't shake the sensation of that touch. Trying to calm herself, she pulled the blankets over her head, forcing herself to breathe slowly. And then, from beneath the covers, she felt a cold hand slowly brush against her cheek. She screamed and leapt out of bed, running downstairs with her heart pounding, too terrified to even look back. She stayed in the living room the rest of the night with every light in the house on, too afraid to go back to her room. She never felt the hand again, but for years, she slept with the lights on, afraid that one night, the phantom touch might return. The Abandoned Cabin. Lily and her friends were on a weekend hiking trip in the mountains when they stumbled upon a small, weathered cabin hidden behind a thicket. The door was slightly ajar, and the windows were clouded with years of dirt. Despite the eerie vibe, curiosity got the best of them, and they decided to step inside for a quick look. The interior was sparse, a single table, a few chairs, and a dusty, old bed. The air was thick and stale, and something about the silence was unnerving. They found strange markings carved into the walls, random symbols and crude figures, like something out of an old horror movie. As they were exploring, one of them accidentally knocked over an old metal tin on the table, spilling its contents. Inside the tin were dozens of small, torn pieces of paper. On each one, written in a shaky hand, was the same phrase over and over: "They know. They're watching." As they stood there frozen, one of them noticed a shadow pass by the window. They were miles from anyone, or at least, so they thought. In a panic, they bolted out of the cabin, not stopping until they were far down the trail. That night, in their tents, they kept hearing faint rustling noises and swore they saw shadows flitting through the trees just outside. They didn't sleep at all that night, and none of them ever went hiking in that part of the mountains again. The Sleep Talker. Ben had recently moved in with his girlfriend, Sarah, and he was over the moon about their new life together. But soon after moving in, he noticed something odd. Every few nights, she would talk in her sleep, mumbling soft, strange phrases that he couldn't quite make out. At first, he thought it was cute, but then he started noticing a pattern. She would say the same words, in the same chilling tone: "Don't let him in. Don't let him in." One night, curiosity got the best of him, and he tried to record her. When he played back the audio the next morning, he heard her voice, whispering in a voice that didn't sound quite like hers. It was low, almost a growl, repeating the same phrase again and again: "He's watching. He's watching." Disturbed, he tried to ask her about it, but she brushed it off, claiming she couldn't remember her dreams. But that night, Ben woke up to her sitting straight up in bed, eyes wide open, staring at the corner of the room. "Sarah?" he whispered, his voice shaky. She didn't respond. Her gaze was fixed on something unseen, her face twisted in an expression of fear. Then she turned to him, her eyes unfocused, and whispered, "He's in the room with us." Ben moved out the next week, unable to shake the feeling that something truly sinister had been lurking there all along. The face in the mirror. Danielle was staying in an old Victorian bed and breakfast on a solo trip across the country. She'd heard the place was haunted, but she wasn't one to believe in that kind of thing. The room she was given was quaint, filled with antique furniture and an enormous, ornate mirror hanging above the dresser. She spent the first day sightseeing and came back exhausted, falling asleep almost immediately. Around 2 a.m., she woke up, parched. She got up, went to the bathroom, and was on her way back when she glanced at the mirror. That's when she saw it. A pale figure stood behind her, its face just inches from hers. Its eyes were sunken, its mouth a thin, unnatural smile that stretched too wide, and it looked straight into her eyes through the mirror. Danielle froze, unable to move or breathe, as the figure's mouth moved, whispering her name in a voice like wind through dead leaves. She stumbled backward, hitting the wall, and as she turned to run, she looked back at the mirror. The figure was gone. She spent the rest of the night in the lobby, terrified, and checked out as soon as the sun rose, vowing never to go near that bed and breakfast again.
The Watcher in the Woods. I had always loved hiking alone. There's something serene about being enveloped by nature, away from the noise of everyday life. But one particular trip into the woods changed everything. It was late autumn, the leaves a fiery tapestry of red and gold. I set off early, the sun barely peeking over the horizon. As I ventured deeper, the sounds of chirping birds and rustling leaves faded, replaced by an eerie silence that made my skin crawl. I brushed it off. Nature can be quiet sometimes. After a couple of hours, I stumbled upon a small clearing. The sunlight filtered through the trees, creating a beautiful scene that felt almost surreal. I decided to take a break, sipping water while soaking in the tranquility. But as I sat there, a strange feeling washed over me, as if I was being watched. I glanced around, dismissing the thought as paranoia, just the trees, I told myself. Yet the feeling persisted. I couldn't shake the sensation that someone, or something, was lurking just beyond my line of sight. I stood up, trying to shake off the unease, and decided it was time to head back. As I turned, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. A figure darted between the trees. My heart raced. I squinted, trying to make sense of it, but nothing was there. Just shadows playing tricks on me, I reasoned. I quickened my pace, my instincts screaming that I needed to leave. The path I had taken now felt foreign. Every twist and turn seemed unfamiliar, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. I glanced over my shoulder repeatedly, but all I saw were the gnarled branches swaying in the wind. Eventually, I reached a fork in the trail. One path led back toward the parking area, the other deeper into the woods. My gut told me to take the first, but something tugged at my curiosity. I took the second path, convinced it would lead me back quicker. The deeper I went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees closed in, their twisted trunks and thick branches blocking the sunlight. I heard a faint rustling behind me, but chose to ignore it, focusing on finding my way back. After what felt like an eternity, I stumbled into another clearing, one I had never seen before. Panic set in as I realized I was hopelessly lost. Just as I started to turn back, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. There, among the trees, stood a figure, a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes staring directly at me. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. His skin was pale, almost gray, and he wore tattered clothing that blended with the bark of the trees. "Help me," he croaked, his voice raspy and barely audible. I could see his mouth moving, but I felt a pull inside me not to approach him. I turned to run, heart pounding, but he called out again, "You can't escape." The words chilled me to the bone. I bolted down the path, branches snagging at my clothes, the sound of footsteps echoing behind me. I didn't look back until I reached the fork again. The other path seemed like a bad idea, but I had no choice. I chose it, praying it would lead me out. I ran blindly, my breath coming in ragged gasps, fueled by adrenaline. Finally, I spotted a glimmer of light through the trees, the parking area. I sprinted toward it, fear giving me strength. I burst through the tree line and into the open, collapsing against my car. I looked back, half expecting the figure to emerge from the woods. But there was nothing, just the rustling leaves and the fading light of day. I drove away, heart racing, vowing never to hike alone again. Months later, I still think about that day. What was that figure? Was he really lost, or was he something else entirely? Sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear his voice echoing in my mind, a reminder that not all who wander in the woods make it back. The caller. I had just settled into bed when my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but I answered anyway, half expecting a robocall. "Hello," I said, but all I heard was heavy breathing on the other end. I hung up, brushing it off as a prank. It was late, after all. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed again. It was the same number. I ignored it, feeling uneasy. Then came the text. "I see you." My heart sank. I glanced out my window into the darkness, seeing only my quiet street. Trying to shake off the fear, I turned off my phone and went to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. My mind raced, imagining the worst. The next morning, I received another message. "You shouldn't have ignored me." I decided to block the number. A week passed, and I thought I was in the clear. Then, late one night, I heard a noise outside my window, a soft tapping. My heart raced as I crept to the curtain, peering through the slats. Nothing, just the empty street. I returned to bed, feeling foolish for being scared. Then my phone buzzed again. It was a new message, "Look outside." My breath caught in my throat. I froze, staring at the screen. Against my better judgment, I approached the window. When I looked out, my heart dropped. There, in the moonlight, stood a figure. I couldn't see their face, but they were staring directly at me. Panicking, I backed away, tripping over my own feet. I fumbled for my phone to call the police. Just as I hit dial, the figure moved closer. I could barely breathe, fear paralyzing me. Then I heard the most chilling sound, my own voice echoing from the phone. "I see you." I turned to my screen in horror, realizing the figure was right outside, mocking me. The basement. My grandmother's house was old and creaky, but I loved visiting her during the summer. She had a basement filled with antiques, and one day curiosity got the better of me. I ventured down the rickety stairs, the air growing colder with each step. Dust danced in the beams of light filtering through the small window. My grandmother had always warned me never to go down there alone, but I was determined to explore. As I rummaged through boxes, I found an old, ornate mirror. It looked out of place, the glass clouded with age. I wiped it with my sleeve, and my reflection blinked back at me, except it didn't look quite right. For a moment, I saw not just myself, but a dark figure behind me in the mirror. I spun around, but the basement was empty. Shaking off the sensation, I turned back to the mirror. The figure was gone, but now my reflection looked distorted, grinning maliciously. I felt a chill run down my spine. "This is ridiculous," I muttered, attempting to shake off my fear. But every time I looked away, I could feel its presence creeping closer. Suddenly, I heard my grandmother calling from upstairs. Relieved, I set the mirror down and rushed to the stairs. As I ascended, I glanced back. The reflection was still there, grinning wider. I never went back to the basement again. To this day, I wonder what I really saw that day. Sometimes, late at night, I think I can hear whispers from below, beckoning me to return. The doll. I inherited an old porcelain doll from my aunt when she passed away. It was beautiful, albeit a bit eerie with its cracked face and lifelike eyes. I placed it on my shelf, but soon after strange things began to happen. At first, it was subtle. I'd find the doll turn slightly, its gaze seemingly following me. I brushed it off as my imagination, but then one night, I awoke to the sound of soft giggling. I glanced at the clock. It was 2:00 a.m. My heart raced as I listened. The giggling continued, growing louder. I sat up, scanning my dark room. That's when I noticed the doll was no longer on the shelf. I leaped out of bed, scanning the room in a panic. Suddenly, I spotted it in the corner, standing upright on the floor. My breath caught in my throat. "What the hell?" I whispered to myself.